Welcome everyone. Just to begin with, I just want to say that I'm honored to be invited by Pat and Kachi for joining this community of SATA to begin this journey together across Asia. It's my privilege to be joining with Rui An and Jooyoung Oh on this panel discussion. So for this panel discussion, the rundown will be we will begin with some introduction by the two artists on how their recent project being a journey involving generative AI or other AI technology in their project, diving into this metaphor of blind man and the elephant, as in how it illustrates these individual personal experiences and perception can only offer a fragmented view of the whole picture, and how these research-based practice of them are trying to gather more different perception and experiences and information for this technology to generate a more speculative or more other interesting fact or reality for the future and the representation of future. So without further ado, I would say that we will have Rui An, we will have Rui An to introduce his project, and then it will be Jooyoung, and then we will have our discussion after. So I'll pass this section to Rui An.
Thanks, Celia, and thank you to SATA for inviting me to be a part of this very enriching 4 days program. Today I'm going to be talking about a body of work that I developed in the past 2 years or so around the question of artificial intelligence, or to be more accurate, the idea of intelligence in itself. So for most of my practice, I wouldn't exactly describe myself as a technologist or someone who works with tech all the time, but I have a interest in the politics and history of technology. So most of my work takes the form of more durational historical research, and the work can take is presented through the mediums of lectures, essays, films, installations. So the series of work that I'm talking about today was made beginning in 2023, and they more or less started as a commission from CADIS and the Centre Pompidou back in 2023, in which they were, as part of a program in which they were looking at the implications of the current wave of generative AI upon artistic production as well as society at large. So the work that I'm going to be talking today is a work that I showed, that I produced as part of that commission, but it was also a work that I first presented as part of my solo exhibition in Singapore. This was an exhibition called Post-Production Fever, and this is one of the installation views of the series of work I'm going to be talking about today. So the main work within this body of research is called Figures of History and the Grounds of Intelligence. Like most of my works, it is presented as both like a video installation, although this is not strictly speaking only a video installation, as I will kind of describe later. One of the screens is actually showing a computer program that is live generating images. So this work is also presented as a live performance. This live performance is pretty much in the form of a lecture that I deliver in front of a live audience. It's kind of about a 70-minute long lecture, so obviously I won't have time to go through the entire narrative today, and I will only kind of talk a little bit about certain threads that I'm exploring in this lecture. But just a kind of comment on the form of the lecture. So you see two screens, and on the left screen are images. Is actually images that you typically see in my past works, in which these are images sourced from historical archives or from popular culture. They would include still images, some film excerpts, etc. But on the right screen is actually a program that is live transcribing my lecture as I'm speaking. And so you see the text that is written on the screen. This is actually the transcript of the kind of voice recognition software. and that transcript is then directly fed into AI model. In this case, we were using a kind of modified version of Stable Diffusion. And from that process, you have images being generated live by the model as I'm speaking. So in that sense, every time I perform this work, I myself can't quite expect, what is being shown on the right screen, because as you can sometimes see, it would transcribe my voice very inaccurately sometimes, and even if it does transcribe it accurately, it may not. The images that it generates can be quite unpredictable. So sometimes and then the funny thing is that because I'm not looking at the screen, I'm looking at the audience. Sometimes I look at the audience and they're they're bursting out laughing, and I have no idea why. Partly because you really can't expect what are the images that is being produced by this program. But to kind of jump into the narrative of this work really started out. It was kind of the starting point for this work was actually a rather funny encounter I had in 2016 when I was invited to. Why does this thing keep popping up? When I was invited to Paris to be a part of machine learning and an arts and machine learning summit that was being convened by Google at that time. It was held at the Google Cultural Institute in Paris, so they flew in different artists and designers for this half-day summit. So this was an event where some of the artists who were in residence at the Google Cultural Institute were presenting some of these applications they had developed while they were there. And so one of the artists, this French interaction designer, Rui An, he presented this application called Portrait Matcher, and it quite simply is an application that uses a photograph that you upload into the application and then tries to match the face that appears in this photograph with a face that appears in one of the paintings in Google Arts collection. I think there are like 40,000 or so images, or maybe more. And so as he was kind of demonstrating this software, I noticed a familiar face, which I could tell almost immediately belongs to this painting that is in the National Gallery of Singapore. So this painting is called Epic Poem of Malaya. It was painted in 1955 by the social realist painter Chua Mia Tee. And it's very much in Singapore, at least a kind of historic or iconic painting that represents a very important period of time in our history, which was the height of the post-colonial movement. So these people you see gathering there, it is a kind of a gathering of students who are trying to articulate their vision for the Malayan nation to come. So it's very much an image that speaks to the birth of a certain kind of national consciousness. But of course, as this painting kind of leaves the museum, the State Museum, and enters the neural networks of Google's collection, it becomes applied to a very, very different purpose. And in this case, the face with which it was matched is, the resemblance is uncanny, to be generous. But I think there's a lot we can say about these two images being placed together, but I was more interested in really what it means for this image, this painting, to travel, from an institution like the National Gallery of Singapore and enter the artificial neural networks of a multinational corporation like Google. Because for me, this movement is not just a movement from one place to another. It is actually also a movement from one system of power, which you can say is an older system of power that we are more familiar with, and a new kind of complex and difficult to kind of grasp system of power that we're dealing with today. So if you think about the painting as it sits in the National Gallery, it is a painting selected by museum curators in a museum that is tasked with telling a certain national narrative. So it is a painting that pretty much belongs to the paradigm of nation states and state power. But as this painting leaves this museum, it also leaves this system of power and enters into a completely new kind of network of power that we are dealing with right now, a network of power that, in fact, nation states are struggling to regulate. If you think about how states are, struggling to devise regulation and time to contain or control some of these excesses of generative AI that we are seeing right now. So essentially, the work became about that. The narrative that I wanted to tell was really about this history. It's a political history. It's also a technological history. So it's a history in which politics and technology are inherently intertwined with each other. So the work, Figures of History and the Grounds of Intelligence, is essentially a story about this history. And to tell this history, I actually wanted to go back to this moment in 1955 to understand, what else was happening in that moment and how these events could actually tell us about this very interesting moment that we are going through today. So to go back into that moment in 1955, of course, as I mentioned, this was the height of the anti-colonial movement. And of course, facing this wave of anti-colonial resistance within the region, specifically Malaya and Singapore, the British, so Singapore and Malaya were British colonies like Hong Kong. The British wanted to ensure that the post-colonial government that would succeed the British would be one that would be amenable to the British commercial interests even after they depart. And of course, this also meant that they had to contain the very, very aggressive communist left-wing elements across Malaya and Singapore. And to do so, they launched a series of counterinsurgency measures against the Malayan Communist Party. And one of it was the establishment of the Malayan New Villages. So these is an image of the Malayan new villages that were established all over the peninsula, into which about 500,000 people were relocated. Essentially these were, of course they were called new villages, but essentially they were concentration camps into which a lot of the ethnic Chinese population, because they were seen as the primary base of the Communist Party, were relocated. But it's important to think about this entire political experiment as also one of the first experiments in kind of systems engineering and data collection. It was within the new villages that the British devised a lot of systems, methodologies for collecting information, intelligence from the villages, because these were the intelligence that they required to know, where the communists were located, which villages were helping the colonies, the communists who was giving them food and shelter. So a lot of, and today, interestingly, the Malayan, so this broader period from 1950s to 1960s is called the Malayan Emergency. And the Malayan Emergency is largely seen today within military history as a very successful counterinsurgency experiment. So you can see it being referenced later in the US military reports when they are looking at Afghanistan and Iraq. They are often taking reference from the Malayan Emergency. So some of and so this was a very, very kind of crucial event within this broader history of the military application of some of these methods of data collection, intelligence, etc. So this image, for instance, one of the methods in which they collected information was actually to get the villages to drop slips of paper into these collection boxes periodically, and this was a method for them to offer information anonymously about their fellow villagers. But what was also quite interesting was that the British saw this exercise as almost a kind of rehearsal for electoral democracy, where you would come every week or so or periodically to drop these little ballots into boxes. And for them, this was also their way of trying to show the villagers that this British model of social democracy is much better than whatever the communists could give you. It is important to note, as I mentioned, this was a very kind of important moment in kind of global military history, and this was immediately seen in the events of Vietnam when the British advisors from Malaya were directly sent to South Vietnam to advise them on how to contain the communists. And it was also in Vietnam where something similar to the new villages was constructed. These were the strategic hamlets that were being built by the South Vietnamese government. Unfortunately, this was fortunately or unfortunately, this was a very this was by and large a failed experiment because of the corruption within the South Vietnamese government, and so this pretty much didn't work, and it actually eventually led to the Americans joining the Vietnam War more aggressively. A more successful emulation of the Malayan emergency was actually carried out in Kenya. So in Kenya, they also built the Kenyan new villages, pretty much serving the same functions. of containing radical elements, extracting data, analyzing these data, and as a way to manage a population. So we're kind of in the mid-50s, entering the 60s, and what you're seeing now is quite a strange phenomenon where across the world, across this rapidly decolonizing world, you see this global chain of new villages starting to emerge. And this is also where the story gets a little interesting. So we, most of us who have done media studies or went to art school would have heard of Marshall McLuhan. We would be or even if you haven't read Marshall McLuhan's, this Canadian media theorist, his book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, you would have heard this very popularized expression, the global village, and it's being used to describe the globalized society we live in today, which is being connected through the networks of modern technology. And is also used to think, and Marshall McLuhan is largely seen as anticipating the internet as we know today. But what's very, very interesting is that, okay, so you look at this, so this is where the sentence in which the global village appears, where he says the human family now exists under conditions of a global village. We live in a single constricted space resonant with tribal drums. Of course, one of Marshall McLuhan's key thesis was that new media, media technologies would bring us to a kind of pre-alphabetic and so-called more primitive or tribal mode of experiencing the world. So it is a way of experiencing the world that is less about the written word, less about the type, than about sound, images. So it's more sensorial, and you think about video conferencing as compared to letter writing. And so this was one of his key arguments. But if you start to look into the book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, and you start to look at the footnotes of Marshall McLuhan, you realize that he got a lot of his ideas from British ethnopsychiatrists, from anthropologists, who were doing all this media reception studies. And these were all actually colonial research that were being undertaken mostly in Africa. And interestingly, a lot of this media research actually happened within some of these new villages that the British were constructing. As I mentioned, these villages were not just military sites, they were also sites where a lot of experiments in terms of media reception, because they were exposing the villagers to all kinds of media campaigns, whether it's radio, print, television. And so a lot of these ideas of new media were actually first tested out within these counterinsurgency projects. And so this actually gives us a very different kind of history or understanding of media studies as we know it, because it seems then that the entire discipline of media studies, as it was first emergent in the 1960s, is actually built upon this much more obscure history of counterinsurgency that was happening across the British colonies and across colonies across the world at that time. So of course, with this, we come back to the present day, generative AI. I can't tell you the entire history from that moment to this moment, but obviously in today's AI models, we continue to see the way in which the colonial past is haunting the present, the way in which how AI becomes racially coded as a result of biases within the data set. And this is why you have images being generated by AI that looks like this. But at the same time, because a lot of the discussion around AI, around the ethical problems of AI, has been centered around data sets. So the idea that because the data sets are skewed towards a particular demographic, it produces biased results. But for me, it's also equally important to think about not just the data set, but also the very logic of generative AI itself. So you see this image of, I guess some of you would notice what's wrong with this image. Those of us who have played with AI would know that it's very, very, very bad at generating hands. It can't generate hands with the right amount of fingers. So obviously, the AI model has no lack of hands, so it's not a problem of a lack of data. We have a lot of data with 5-fingered hands, but obviously the AI still continues to generate hands with 6 fingers or more. So the question then is, why is it that AI continuously does this? Why is AI so good at particular things? It's very good at producing textures. It's very good at producing landscapes, but it can't even understand the number of fingers on a human hand. It has trouble understanding basic mathematics. And of course, a big part of this is due to the fact that the way that AI sees the world is completely different from the way we understand the world. And the way it looks at an image is not to really understand the image or to understand its meaning, its composition, so to speak, but to rather break down every image into, individual noise samples. And then try to map these noise samples according to probability, statistics, etc. So obviously because of that, it doesn't understand the meaning of these images, and not to mention the history behind these images. And so fundamentally for me, the question here then is really the relationship between intelligence and history. And I mean this in the sense that the only reason why AI today is able to generate the images that it can is because of the vast amount of historical data that we have already been generating since the beginning of time by humans and non-humans alike. But its relationship to this history is merely that of extraction. It extracts this history, but it doesn't fundamentally understand it or needs to understand it in order to do the work that it does. I'm just going to go a little bit quicker. So as part of, in addition to the work that I presented, the installation that I presented, I also worked on this broader timeline, which is called A History of Intelligence in Singapore, that was presented next to the work. And this timeline is basically articulating a 200-year history of intelligence. And my starting point for this project was really I realized that why are we talking about artificial intelligence when we haven't even fully grasped what is intelligence? Before we even jump the gun and talk about AI, what is it exactly we are talking about when we are talking about intelligence? Is intelligence necessarily good? If something is intelligent, does it mean that something else is dumb? Something is stupid? Who gets to decide what is intelligent and what is dumb? And so once you start approaching this AI with this premise or with these set of questions, you realize you open yourself into a history that is not just a technological history. It is in fact a deeply political history, and it is also a colonial history, which is why this timeline for me has to begin in the early 1800s, which is pretty much the beginning of the colonization of Singapore. And for me, like this, and I realized that intelligence becomes such a useful concept for me to think about the entire history of Singapore, because when I look at the entire history of Singapore, almost every major event could be somewhat accounted for within this history. So just to point out some little moments, so you have, for instance, the observation of gutta percha in Singapore by the British. So gutta percha is a kind of resin that's being produced by by trees that are native to Singapore and Malaya. And at that time, the British were trying to find a suitable material to coat submarine cables, and rubber was always disintegrating underwater. So it was gutta percha that provided them with this solution. Gutta percha traveled then to London. It was presented at the Society of Arts, and then it led to the successful laying of the first commercial undersea telegraph cable between Dover and Calais. And so this was how Singapore was, from very, very early on, an essential part of this technological history. But later on, as we go into the 60s, you see a different set of movements. You see, in the 60s, as Singapore was, after its independence, it was trying to import a lot of intelligent or smart practices from all over the world. So this was a period in which Singaporean civil servants were going overseas to study different models. They were going to Shell to study its personnel management system, which it eventually brought back to Singapore to be implemented across the civil service. So the whole 60s and 70s was all about this set of movement of experts, the movement of all these smart people to advise Singaporean policy. But interestingly then, towards the 80s, you then start to see Singapore becoming a model for other localities. So for instance, we enter the 90s, you see Chinese delegations coming to Singapore to study its model, and eventually this led to the first kind of government-to-government joint venture between China and Singapore to develop the Suzhou Industrial Park. And I think for me, in putting together this timeline, it was intended as an attempt to really try to bring together political, economic, and technological history to understand how these histories are all deeply connected. And I also imagine the timeline as a kind of conversation piece where it becomes a start of conversations for people. And in Singapore, we also did a little workshop with generative AI where we got the audiences, the participants of the workshop, to generate images that they feel that speak to histories or events that are missing from this timeline. But I think through this experiment, we realized that what it revealed was actually more the limits of AI in actually addressing these histories, because very often the images that they tried to generate, was quite inaccurate or unable to speak to these very, very kind of obscure histories. So I'll end at this point, and I'm happy to take any questions later. Yeah, thank you.
I guess maybe I'll leave the question to later, like after the discussion point. So thank you, Rui An, for really talking about all these complexity of historical happenings or research that he has done in this recent project. And we kind of can see between these known and unknown, there's these vast of intelligence and data and information that has been fragmented and doesn't really give a whole picture nowadays. And that's why so many artists, researchers are still trying to uncover, evoke these perspectives. And especially for very personal, even family on a family history level, there are all these hidden voices hasn't been resurfaced as well. So I think in Jooyoung's practice, there's a particular project that really uncovered that. So without further ado, I'll pass it to Jooyoung, and thank you.
Hi, my name is Jooyoung Oh, and I'm a media artist based in Seoul, South Korea. I have been conducting research on co-evolutions with non-human-centered machines, and I would like to first briefly share some of my work related to the talk and introduce my recent work, Literally Girl Project. So first is the birthmark that I did in the commission by ACC Gwangju in Korea in 2017. So I have my background very weird. I started my artist career as a photographer in 2013. Later I decided to make my own Photoshop, so my own build systems. I entered engineering school to study how to program. That was what is behind the screen. And for 5 years, I only managed to make one image. So my final research image concludes this system, intelligent system of birthmark. I used 1970s old program. The developer was 19 years old and he was still alive. So I was very moved. But this is the virtual model that appreciates the artwork surrogates and how well it conveys the artist's invention. Basically, this work, my work watches all the other works in the exhibition site, and I get these videos of the artist's image and ask them what the audience want to see. And then I trained with the 19,000 basic objects learning model. So the whole point was to maybe experience or question if the complex symbol system based on information theory can really understand or appreciate art. Of course, it failed. I failed very sadly, and it was really funny. And I want to use projection and also the 1970s projector, which shows the gap between the current technology and the algorithm that we were using at that time to be high tech, but it was not high tech. Yeah. So next was in the middle of COVID, most of my exhibition was cancelled or closed. So I want to survive. That's why I made games about the AI. Then this is the scope of the cloud. At that time, I was imagining a game set, but in a floating city in 2051, where the climate refugee struggles to survive. The city relies on urban air mobility, which is like drone taxis. Now, actually this year you can try drone taxis in Korea. It only makes you, it takes like 10 minutes, which was usually 40 minutes away. Of course, it's really expensive, so you have to prepare money. Oh, sorry. Okay. Anyway, this was the game, but I will briefly go to next project. Actually, it was a game about taking roles in the city, where you can become a flight. You cannot fly. You can play a bird or a drone researcher or planner of the city, and each of the protagonists are having different issues in their life, also refugees in climate disaster. So it was open-ending story, but my point was to see the same situation with different viewpoint. And my main goal was to make the flightless bird, which survived only by not flying because they get kicked by the drone taxis all the time. In the future. So that's why further I delved into this weird drone called Castor drone. I imagine the AI drone for bird-human communication in coming UAM era. So the work promotes interspecies sympathy. Sorry, I am not good at English. That's why I made this script. Sorry about this, but the work promotes the sympathy. So instead of using technology for war or like a company, I made only for birds. So this one only works for birds. So it doesn't fly. It just communicates with the birds, like flapping images. But it's really scary because it's the highest prey of every bird. So actually it's not nurturing, it's like threatening the birds, educate them in very weird, ironical way. So this was some of my practice on AI, but actually I want to introduce you today is the topic that is related to blind man and elephant. So I brought this, my chatbot series that I started from 2020. When first GPT-2 introduced, I happened to have opportunity to use it, and each of them developed within the technology of that time, evolving with the data set available at that time. So first one is the Love Counselor, commissioned by Art Center Nabi. It was the chatbot that can consult directly with AI of your own love. So if you have some problem with your love life, you can ask this, and then you can find this with the data set. You can kinda experience the counselor very anonymously. So AI generates appropriate answer based on text exchanges by dating app, internet chat users. To gain data, I searched for developer communities open source, which was, I don't know if it's you ethically okay, but anyway, I filtered one by one, so I didn't have issue, but there was a big issue in Korea actually about using private data. So this one was very censored, so don't worry. But anyway, to gain data, I searched for that kind of open chat or like a chat system like SimSimi. You can just use with you can just chat to this AI, and then they collect every data you write, and it was in my hand. So be careful. But I didn't use it for anything else, so I just. So this is the one that I made out of the data-driven the stories. So I made like 4 AI-generated visual novel installation featuring 4 love story created by GPT-3. At that time, there was GPT-3. So while the protagonists are all deepfake, there was a real actual models, and then I faked all the deepfake videos. So the face are different. So to blend the real and artificial performers, reinforcing the work's core concept that this is nobody's love story, yet simultaneously everyone's. This is to challenge the belief about love by presenting narrative crafted entirely by anonymous data. So when you think about dating app, you don't meet each other, but you send this text and get intimate. That's very interesting situation. So I was questioning whether AI can understand based on only text. Is there a love or not? Something like that. So this was the first trial, and the second trial was after the both. There was an invitation. Then in the Jooyoung Oh Museum of Art, I showed this literary board, and here I collected 300 million Korean dialogues from 48 plays of Korean literature text published between 1920s to 80s. It lets the user to short conversation with the past Korean people. Like it sounds really old, like a grandfather's sound. So I couldn't have time, but I will just briefly say, like, do you know artist Jooyoung Oh? And he says, hey, you are professional-less poet. You're like amateur poet. So it's like it scolded me. So yes, it sounded very funny, and it was more like experimenting rather than like criticizing the technology. But later on, I find out that most of the data was missing after that, because I was using the copyright expired Korean literary work, which was shared in the site, and the only data that woman wrote there was just one, Na Hae-seok. She was the writer and essay. She was the new woman, first generation new woman who got a public education. So that was shocking for me, because this literary girl board was actually the next project. That's why I am introducing Gubo AI first. So inspired by my grandmother's short novel, my family had a love with the literature culture. So I don't know why, but now I find out that my grandmother used to like send me like writing something, and then become an author or something like that. She encouraged me to write something, but I became like a weird media artist, so she didn't understand until the end. But anyway, this AI project actually was started from my grandmother's debut story. So I never knew before. So she never told us about her dream and her story until her death. And then we found out this folded, very well written text from her bedside. And then I wanted to find out what would have she wrote when she was in my age. So at that time, I was also wondering what happened to her. Why didn't she continue writing something? So this was my second question. And then at that time, there was very few women writers in Korea, and they were referred as yeoryu, which means female, a term that diminished their work value, often characterized their writing as very emotional, sentimental, or illogical. So they were frequently labeled as something not important. So even today, literary critics don't place much value on, even though there is vast amount of essays, they don't even look at it as a proper thing to criticize. So I didn't have data at all. So I want to make the same chatbot, but there was no data. It was very, very sad. So I wanted to unveil and center this girl's essay who tried to be a woman writer but ended up as literary girls. There was a term, literary girl. So I made the 1974 because when there was the year the women liberation movement happened globally. So I was wondering what happened to Korea at that time. I recognized that there was absolutely no data or digitized, so I was running around the Korean second-hand bookshop. I happened to retain a lot of forgotten books of that era in very, very cheap price, very cheap. So I have a bunch of them, and then I took every picture of it, and then I did OCR. But it was really hard because it was all this way written, like upright written, so it was really hard. But anyway, we are out of time, so I will going to be quickly end up this talk. So this time I made a AI, but very unfaithful and unkind, a deliberate rebellion against the obedient digital assistant. Like if you want answer, it doesn't have answer because unlike typical chatbot, it is optimized for everyday conversation. That is optimized. This chatbot responds only to the questions related to their interest. Like if you ask hi, they don't answer. I'm not interested in saying hi, something like that. But if you write something like I want to be a writer, it suddenly reveals like a first generation woman writer. We never learned at school. It was sad. But now Lee Sung-ja, she's now studied in Korean art scene. Like she's first generation like a printmaker. And then I was really shocked. Oh, who is she? Then yeah. So this chapter shows a lot of this even unknown to the unknown. So we don't even know if they existed. So anyway, these historical literary stories are original, and I didn't use any AI to remodel the answers. So this is actually the sentences from the exact books that the girls wrote. Yeah, thank you for your listening. You can see actually more. I also made a video out of the text. So this is the sound of the 1916's girl's voice. Yeah. So I failed a lot. Like I wanted first to make an image out of the magazine, but the professor who studied for 30 years only literary girl, she said it's not them. It's only an advertisement image of the girls. So I really took out the girls magazine and then find the real prize winners at that time. So I only used AI in here, like on voice. And they are very interesting. They are saying, I'm not a child, or like, I don't want to get married. My life will be ruined after something like that. Because at that time, they don't have the further career. They only had to marry and have a baby, and then they become a housewife. And they get educated, but now they have compelling values that the society doesn't want women writers, something like that. Happened in 1970s. So now I understand my grandmother's situation, and I can appreciate more. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. So I guess like for the next part, we really want to unpack the intersectionality between these historical contexts, personal perceptions, this fragmented view, how it actually contributes to the wider reality that we are trying to predict or trying to represent through the technology as well. So I have some prompts to discuss with the artists in this section. So for the first, I would say, because what Jooyoung has mentioned about these hidden female literary voices, and also the historical truth and facts from Rui An's kind of research and project, what exactly the reality that you would like to actually attempting to represent through this generative AI or through this chatbot? Do you think that it actually create more conflicting or more actually even, as you mentioned, more bias in this reality representation? And also how this multiplicity of perspective really deviate from maybe the original historical context, and what are these visible cracks it create from these contrasts, how it relate to your current research.
Hello. I guess a lot of my starting point for the works that I shared was really about trying to think about the broader history of technology, or trying to historicize technology, because I think history and technology are often seen as two different things. You know, you don't really see them put together, and I also feel like a lot of technologies are not necessarily the people who will be most interested in history. In fact, they tend to they are always the ones who will be proposing ways to fix a system without sometimes understanding how such a system was, you know, the historical conditions that created such a system to begin with, and why it is so difficult to, you know, fix the system, whether you think about the system as democracy or capitalism or whatever, you know. The technological instinct is always to ignore history and to see it purely as a technical problem requiring, you know, a certain mode of reorganization. And I think that has something, so for me, like a big part of my project or my practice in general is always to recuperate a kind of historical consciousness to something. And I always feel like we are living in an age of amnesia. You know, we are going through a lot of crisis, but I think every time, ironically, a state of crisis often leads you to be overly obsessed with the present without actually trying to and causing you to kind of turn away from history, because you're so occupied with you know, the things that are popping up every day. You're trying to deal with something, or you're trying to troubleshoot something, and so in that extent, you know, history or becomes a luxury. You know, the ability to contemplate the past becomes a luxury in a times of crisis, even though it actually is much more important than ever. So in that spirit, a lot of my work is about trying to understand, you know, what led us to this point, and I think that is present in the work that I shared. Yeah.
For me, I work at the intersection of technologies and art, attempting to restore narrative that is excluded from usually mainstream discourse. The literary girl project resurrects memories of women writers erased under the label of female literatures. By using AI and analog research together, I want to question technology, actually who to choose and who to remember or forget. Beginning with my grandmother's project, grandmother's published manuscript, I was actually to reconstruct the marginalized voices through data, sounds, and images. These are the subjects that are forgotten because they were never recorded from the start. For that, I employ iterative rescaling. I want to like narrow down and find different aspects and visualize. First, I visualized like a magazine cover, and then I felt like it's not them. So I again read all these texts before AI like program, and then I choose my own selections. Actually, there was advertisement side and also the literary girl side. So it was really handpicking everything. I have to handpick everything to reveal how their voice created a crack in the system. So yeah, this process, I think, I think is about how the unrecorded can re-emerge through the speculative computations.
So, for example, for these, like, I think for both of you, you have spent a lot of time for this research process to work before you actually fit into these AI or generative model in order to be part of the project kind of output as well. So for these like intensive process of like getting to personal archive or historical archive and interviews and all these observatory methodology, these require these active act of touch on a very personal level or from your artistic perspective. So from these like act of touch from a personal level versus going into the system with the intelligence kind of touch on these model. So how do you perceive this role like of personal touch as in subjective factor, and how do you see the result compared to like how the relationship between?
Yeah, I think a kind of common thread between Jooyoung's practice and mine is also there's this engagement with technology, but there's also this engagement with archives. And I was really moved to first hear her share about her trying to kind of uncover all these literary girl publications, because in my own work, I've also had to, sometimes I look at official archives, I realize the data is not there. I've also had to turn to kind of other sources or independent archives, or you buy it off the secondhand markets. I feel like the process of data collection is inherently a tactile process, and it's also a social process, because you meet archivists, you meet people who collect these materials, and very often the process of collecting is actually very, very personal. Why they choose to start a collection, why there is AAA to begin with, for instance. Every single archive actually begins from a very personal story. So I feel like this social aspect is basically vanishes when archives are increasingly digitized, or when AI actually comes to replace some of this very tedious kind of archival labor. And of course, I appreciate the fact that documents have been OCR'd and I can easily pull them out, and so like in a way, like I think AI or technology in general can help to make a lot of these things much more convenient. It makes the process faster, but I think it's also very important to understand the deeply situated natures of archives and of archival work in general. And that's the difference between like a human historian and an AI historian, because even if you're a historian, every historian approaches this history from a personal space. Even if they may not have undergone this history, they would have brought into this history their own perspectives as someone who has lived through a certain time, and which is also why I feel like one of the things, in a way, like historical work becomes even more important, because I mean, apart from making these works, I've also been doing a lot of documentary kind of filmmaking in that vein, and to a certain extent, I realized with the rise of generative AI, actually the documentary form becomes even more important, because when you're doing a documentary, if you can't find it's actually important where the image comes from. If you can't identify your sources, your documentary actually loses credibility. So in that sense, provenance, an art form where provenance is privileged becomes even more important at a time where we are increasingly encountered. When we increasingly encounter images that appear to have no origin or no history, so to speak. Yeah.
Yes, for me, I agree with most of the idea, and for me, I also think that technology is very related to the archive itself. So, for example, I am preparing an exhibitions in Korean's first photography museums. They have this 2000 handled archive, which is put in a very hierarchical and organized way. And I am actually dismantling all of the metadata, like who take and when and what is about. I just made it onto a network of similarity. And if it's important situation, it will be a lot of vast amount of the image of the same scene. And as it get more individual or some unique experience, it will be in the far from the majority. And I found that very interesting. So this kind of touch in the data visualization, I think it will be more and more important because we are living in a world where data is all around us, and we don't, if we don't have the viewpoint of what is real and what is important, maybe there is more importance in one's choice in using data. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for everyone joining this panel. Because of limited time and time overran, like we will cut short on this discussion. But hopefully you will get to speak to the artists in person during the breaks and really talk to them about these perceptions from their project, broadening into a wider overview of the reality in their project. So thank you everyone, and I'll pass it to the second panel.